I just want to welcome you this morning to the Demos and Co-op panel on the opportunity effect. So we're going to be looking at the question, how can business harness social mobility to drive growth? Just to introduce myself, my name is Miriam Levin. I'm the Director of Participatory Programs at Demos, and I'm delighted to welcome a fantastic panel of speakers for this morning's event. To my right, we have the Right Honourable Alan Milburn, former Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, and Chair of the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission. To my left, we have Emma Hoddinott, Assistant General Secretary of the Co-operative Party. Further to my left, we have Stephen Bediako OBE, Social Entrepreneur, Innovator, Impact Investor and Design Expert. And all of those written down when I hear about all of those different aspects. And to my right, Paul Gerrard, Campaigns, Public Affairs and Board Secretariat Director of the Co-operative Group. So this morning, each of our speakers are going to speak for 5 minutes to give their perspectives on the question. Then we'll open this up to a Q&A, so it'll be fantastic to hear your questions for the panel. But before we get going, I just wanted to set the scene a little bit on social mobility. So we're defining social mobility as the relationship between people's life outcomes, like income and occupation, and those of their parents. So where there's a strong relationship between a person's outcome and their parents, there's low social mobility, and where there's a weak link, there's higher social mobility. So we haven't got a huge number in the room, but I just thought it'd be really interesting to find out kind of where everybody is on that spectrum. So can you put your hand up if you feel you have experienced social mobility? And if you feel like you haven't? And anyone who's not sure? Interesting. Okay, it's really interesting to know kind of where people sit kind of with that question and how much people feel it relates to their own experience. What we do know is that social mobility is like an ongoing challenge for the UK. So people's future occupation, their income, their earnings is too often affected by their backgrounds and where they grew up. And there's a lot of talk about the moral case for why we should do something about that, but there's less focus on the business impact, the economic impact of social mobility. So better job matching, use of employee talents and skills that can boost productivity and innovation and growth. And that's despite the fact that estimates from the Sutton Trust show that even a small investment in social mobility agenda can boost GDP growth by between 2 and 4%, which in terms of GDP is a vast amount of money. Achieving economic growth is absolutely central to the new Labour government's mission. So it feels like a really good time to take advantage of kind of all the impact of investing in social mobility and take advantage of the economic opportunities when you actually tackle those issues. But what we're going to be looking at today is what's the role of business within that context. What role can businesses play in increasing social mobility? What's in it for them? What's in it for their employees? What's in it for society as a whole? And one of the reasons for doing that is, unlike schools, where the impact of schools' work on social mobility is vital, but it can take a really long time to take effect, that businesses can have a much more immediate impact in the changes that they make, whether that's improving inclusive recruitment processes, running outreach programs, stop affinity groups, or clearer progression rates. And there are really obvious benefits to businesses, which I hope we're going to hear more about this morning. So initiatives that boost diversity within businesses and support social mobility lead to better business performance, greater productivity, employee retention. They can access a wider talent pool and get different perspectives to kind of help think through the many challenges that businesses face. Sounds like a good idea. It feels a bit like obvious, like obviously we should do something about this, but the question is, how do we do it? And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about this morning. So with that, I'm going to hand over to the panel to get their thoughts on how businesses can improve social mobility. Coming first to you, Alan.
Okay. Can you hear me if I don't use the mic? Yeah. So welcome. Lovely to be joined by my fellow panelists here. Let me start with the challenge and then sort of move on to the opportunity, so to speak. I mean, the challenge is obvious. You know, we've got a deeply divided nation. The gap between the haves and the have-nots in every regard is being widening rather than narrowing. And that's not just about race or gender or class or income, it's between geography and generation as well. And the truth about Britain is that over very many decades, we've become far wealthier, but we struggle to become fairer. And not through want to try. You know, successive governments, institutions, and civil society have tried, but it's hard. And it's young people, I guess, who are on the front line of that division. So, you know, I grew up, like I got very lucky in my life. I was born actually in the peak year, so the academics for social mobility. I was born in 1958, which was the moment when everything in British society was changing. You know, both the transition from a blue collar to a white collar economy, creating what the academics call more room at the top. So working class kids like me, you know, rather than going into a blue collar job, you could go into white collar employment. This was a massive step up. And of course, women's role in society was profoundly changing, the sexual revolution, so on and so forth. So you have these two gigantic economic and social changes happening. And people like me rode the crest of that wave. You know, I'm not unusual in that, you know, I grew up in a council estate, I progressed in society, I was the first in my family to go to university, all of those great things. And then it sort of stalled. And it's been stalling for a very, very, very long time. And that's largely, I think, for two reasons. One, because of changes in the labour market, and where, in particular, skills acquisition has become much more, it's become, unless you get a decent skill, the chances of really advancing or even getting onto the ladder of opportunity is so much lower nowadays. And secondly, because frankly, the education system hasn't done what it was set up to do, which is to close the attainment gap between kids from better off backgrounds and those from worse off. So we've got two principal failures, one in the labour market and one in education. So when you really do the diagnostic, it's important. There's lots of reasons, but those are the fundamental reasons. And you get pretty bleak about it pretty quickly because the data is horrible. You know, only 1 in 8 kids from a low-income background today growing up will go on to be a high-income earner as an adult, despite ability. Despite ability. It's not ability that's unevenly distributed, it's opportunity in society, both in the labour market and in the education system. But here's the opportunity, and Miriam's absolutely right. Like, something profound has changed. First of all, the social model that we have, which is a sort of greater gap between the haves and have-nots, it's sort of reached an unsustainable point, right? Yeah, and people realise that it's not possible. I mean, you can have a model where, you know, in terms of the proceeds of economic growth, the top 10% continue to steam away. That's what's been happening for 40 or 50 years. But in the end, it just doesn't become sustainable. And I think there's a pretty widespread recognition in society now that that's the case, first of all. Second, it's having deeply deleterious effects, not just socially, but economically and politically. Yeah, the great movement that you're seeing of populism exists for a reason. You know, it's not that people are behaving irrationally by voting how they're voting. It's because there are social reasons that are driving this antagonism to the mainstream of politics, which is a failure on all of our parts, by the way, in the mainstream. So you've got to be able to address these issues. Thirdly, we're living at a really interesting time in our country. When Rachel says the number one priority for the government is economic growth, that is right. The biggest constraint on economic growth today, this is an amazing thing to have happened, certainly for my generation. I grew up in the Northeast in the 1980s, you know, where mass unemployment was just a fact of life. Deindustrialization was happening. There was a shortage of jobs. Today, the problem is a shortage of workers. Biggest constraint on economic growth today is a shortage of labor. We're practically in a full employment labor market. And migration, which has been the easy tap for employers to turn on, is now being turned off, because it's become both socially and politically toxic. So suddenly, employers, you can talk to anybody, anywhere, in any profession, whether it's the care sector, the construction sector, or the tech sector. And what's their biggest problem? Biggest problem is the shortage of skilled labour. This is both a problem and an opportunity. And it means for employers, they have to search in places that hitherto they haven't bothered to search. So they have to diversify their workforces. Okay. And that is happening. You see it. I can see Sarah's here with me from the Social Mobility Foundation that I chair. She's the chief executive. And we've seen over the course of these last years, you know, employers, universities, schools, all stepping up to the plate on this issue, driven, of course, by social concerns, but also driven by their own concerns. They've got a problem, and they've got to find a way of addressing it. And fourthly, we're amassing evidence, data, to prove your point, which is diversity really works. For business, a myriad of points of view around the table in a world that's crazy, where there are no straightforward solutions. It's a really good idea to have quite a lot of different points of view, because there's no easy answers anymore. And it's not going to change, my friends. And we know now there are real correlations between the profits of a business and the diversity of its workforce. So we're amassing an evidence base. So this is really good. And the final thing I would say is that, it's interesting, we just had an election and Labour won on a one-word slogan. Change. Change. There's a mood for change. That's right. The country is at that tipping point. It happens. I've seen it twice in my lifetime. This is the third time. I saw it in 79 when Thatcher came to power and the country was ready for it. I didn't agree with it, but the country was ready for it. And I saw it in 97 with Tony. The country was ready for it. The country was ready to move on to something different. And it's true today. The country is ready to move on again. And I would say, although people don't express it like this, sorry, I know I'm being too long, but I'll shut up now, is Rachel and Kia don't describe it like this, but I think what the ambition is, which is an ambition that I think is shared across civil society, business, trade unions, civil institutions in society, etc. The desire is for what I'd call an inclusive economy, where frankly, we harness the benefits of globalization, open borders, free trade, but we mitigate its worst effects by ensuring that there are far more winners and far fewer losers. And the question is, how do we harness that change moment? And that's a job, not just for the government, my friends. That's a job for employers and universities, and the education system and community organizations, and of course, citizens themselves. So we stand on the cusp of something that, look, if you've been in politics, believe me, you've got to be an optimist, right? So, I've remained an optimist, and I'm really it's all really challenging. The data's horrible, all that sort of stuff, right? People are really, up against it. But I'm an optimist because I think there's a moment in time, and this is it, where you can create what I call a movement for change. And it's really great in particular that the Co-op Party and indeed the wider cooperative movement is really part of that. So.
Thank you. Which is a perfect moment to bring in the cooperative party.
Thank you very much. And yes, perfectly teed up. Thank you, Alan. In terms of, I guess, the role that we can play within the cooperative party, because I think Alan shared his story, and social mobility is about people. We've all got our story of our parents and our grandparents and how we feel about that, and our opportunities, our hopes, and maybe those missed opportunities as well. And we were having a discussion just before, you were talking about your generation, Alan, my generation. I started my working life under a Labour government, having gone to university as part of the huge expansion of higher education. And I think there's a real question about what is that change for the next generation coming through with regards to that. And I think both time it's been linked to growth, which is absolutely heart to Labour's mission. But co-ops are about people. Social mobility is about people, and people are at the heart of our business model. It's, co-ops are owned by their members, and our values of equality and democracy go straight through that. And I think we're really keen to play our part in Labour's growth mission to get that fairer economy with regards to that. And when we have this mission around doubling the size of the cooperative sector, and we've had a whole week talking about this, and the movement is ready, and you'll hear more from Paul from the Co-op group about the opportunities ahead and how we can contribute to that. But I just want to touch on, there was an important point. I think you'll hear about businesses and what they're doing now with their workforce, but I think it's how you get that workforce and some of that pre-employment work. Because my story is, I live in Rotherham, where 28.7% of adults are economically inactive. So our unemployment rate is 3%, but actually 1 in 4 adults aren't even seeking work. They are the furthest from the job market, and it's increasing. In the last year, that has increased as well. And I think there's some really important things that business are doing to kind of plug that, and a really interesting sort of collaboration or cooperation between communities, business and the state. And Alan, you'll probably talk a little bit more about this, but you've done the Pathways to Work pilot next door in Barnsley, and I think it's really interesting, the work that has come out about how that, and particularly with the devolution agenda, how place and those communities and business and local government and our mayors can come together to tackle some of these ingrained problems. I think apprenticeships is also really important. I won't steal Paul's thunder, but the Co-op group are absolutely excellent, have been leaders in terms of apprenticeships and the use of their levy as well, and they're linked to their academies as well. But we know reform is needed in terms of apprenticeships, and there's just really simple things that could be done. For example, the start dates of apprenticeships don't match the end of school terms, for example, and if you're from more deprived background, the pressure for you to go out and work and get a job is enormous, and you're being disadvantaged by just the smallest of things. And the other thing I just wanted to say, there are also some really excellent things happening. There's the Bright Futures Co-op again, which the group but other businesses are part of, which is helping victims of modern slavery into employment. And that we know there's numerous schemes like that around the country, helping people particularly disadvantaged to get into the job market. I'm quite interested to hear your thoughts about how the government can do that, but also under devolution, we can accelerate that and make sure that those opportunities are there. I just want to end, because I am the Assistant General Secretary of the Co-op Party, and our chair is Jim McMahon, and he left school at 15. He took up an apprenticeship and is now a Minister of State for local government. But I still feel that that's the exception rather than the rule. And actually, the skills and the training and education are absolutely key to this in terms of the transformation of social mobility.
Wonderful, thank you. Stephen, can I come to you from your perspective as a businessman?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Miriam, and thanks to the panelists and for everyone today for joining. I think similar to Alan, my background is kind of, son of Ghanaian migrants to the East End of London. I was one of 5 kids. Lost my mum at 13, lost my dad at 17. So it really looked bleak for me in those early days. But, again, maybe as an exception, managed to kind of go and get an education during those kind of new Labour years, studied politics, studied public policy, worked in government, worked in consulting, became an entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur, so very much focused on purpose and profit, and have had the absolute privilege of building businesses, working with communities in the UK, in the US, and Canada, it's just been exceptional. And so, definitely have a sense of that social mobility piece. And I think Alan and Emma have set it out really clearly. And maybe I'll just add and build on what they talked about. And I think there are kind of 3 things that we need to think about, both from a perspective of social mobility, but also just in terms of how we grow our economy and build back the country. The first one I would say is that there's definitely something about skills and kind of, getting people the right skills, getting them those skills in the most flexible and accessible ways. We all know now that just a 3 or 4 year degree is not the only route. But I think there's also something about will. Someone told me a long time ago, if you want to do something, you've got to have the skill and the will. And I think there's something about how we re-energize the will in this country to be ambitious, to want to grow, to want to be at the front of the development of humanity, and how we connect that with our ability to deliver skills to people. So I think that's a really important point. I think Alan also touched on this point around inclusive economy. So, I spent 5 years living in San Francisco and I actually built a co-op. I built a co-op staffing agency where we help low-wage workers to find work, but also offer them benefits and ownership in our business. And that really gave me insight into the importance of shared ownership models. And, if you take a business like Uber, imagine if that business that has obviously dominated our global taxi service actually had a shared ownership model of its drivers and shared some of those profits back with its drivers. It'd be remarkable, right? But this period of capitalism we just had didn't do that. And the opportunity is to build a more inclusive capitalist model that would allow us to do that. So that's my second point. And then the third point, I think, is just about, if we really want to see social mobility thrive in this country, we need what I would describe as access to fair wealth creation. And so that means, there are a whole list of people, communities, and places that have been left behind, right? And, what's really important now is to do some targeted investment into those people, places, and communities, infrastructure, support on jobs, and to help generate wealth so that we can see more jobs, we can see more spending, and we can see more tax receipts to the Treasury so that we can invest in our public services. And to that end, one of the vehicles I've founded here in the UK is something called the Pathway Fund. And so this is a fund in partnership with the government to invest in Black and brown entrepreneurs and impact fund managers across the country. And, we are, we're very clear about our focus on Black and brown communities and trying to build those communities so that they can then come to the table of life from a position of strength and contribute to our economy and our society. And, the data shows there's lots of other people and communities that have been left behind, whether it's female, LGBTQ, disabled, the focus on London and the Southeast. I think we just have to be really honest and really targeted in how we try and encourage more fair wealth creation in the country. So, yeah, for me, it's skill and will, building an inclusive economy where we really talk about models of shared ownership and giving people access to fair wealth creation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Paul, can I come to you?
Yeah, just a few points. I work for Co-op Group. The Co-op Group is the world's oldest cooperative. We're also Britain's biggest cooperative, and we are one of the world's biggest cooperatives. And the point about a cooperative, what those people did on a cold December evening in 1844 in Toad Lane in Rochdale, we've come together with a view that they could all get on and prosper rather than just one of them getting on and prospering. And the way they did that is that they worked together. The essence of a cooperative is that you pool your talents and you all get on together, not at the expense of anybody else. And that sounds lovely. Yeah, great. But just not pretend that's something weird. In the world, there are 3 million cooperatives. The revenues of cooperative businesses in the world are 2.4 trillion. 1 in 8 people in the world is a member of a cooperative. This isn't just something that a few people do on a Sunday morning. This is mainstream business models. Less in England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland than it should be, but this is a mainstream model. So when we're talking about wealth creation, shared ownership, cooperation does that. The second point I would make is the role of business. I was just saying to Alan before, I was a civil servant for 20 years. My first working day in central government was probably Alan's first day as a minister in May 1997. I was there for 20 years. My wife's still a civil servant. But businesses have got to recognise that they don't stand there and say, oh, can you do this for us? Businesses have got things that they can do without the help of government. You don't need to keep asking for government to do stuff. I'll give you a quick example. Apprenticeship levy doesn't work. 60% of the money that's paid over for your levy doesn't get spent on expires because it's an 18-month list, right? That's really frustrating. What the co-op did is we said, well, actually, you can donate that money. You can donate some of your, I think it's 20% of your unspent levy to small, medium enterprises, and they can use it to use expenses. That's a good idea. And we did it. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if it wasn't just a co-op? We've now got 98 businesses, all kinds of businesses. Businesses the furthest away from the co-op you could imagine. Businesses like Amazon, who are putting money into that levy match scheme. £25 million of expired levy funds have gone into that and created 2,500 apprenticeships. Interestingly, in SMEs, those apprenticeships, a third are women, a third are caregivers. There's a much higher proportion of black and brown apprentices. And I guess my point is, we didn't get government to do that for us. Business have got to take a bit of responsibility here, because social mobility absolutely is enabled by government and civil society, but in the end, businesses have got an important role to play and a responsibility to play, a responsibility to support those in their supply chains. And I guess the last point I would make is, I grew up in a mill village in Lancashire in that first great change in 1979, and there weren't any mills left, so it's a bit shit. I then grew up as a professional in the government Alan's part of and that Emma talked about, and it was exciting. I think the government have got a tough gig, right? But there's opportunity. There's a chance. And if you combine the growth mission with the opportunity mission, you can see the shape of what can be done. But I absolutely believe cooperation and cooperatives and social enterprises and mutuals have got a role to play, and that's why they've got a double the size commitment. And secondly, businesses have got to step forward and don't say, we've got these problems, what's the government solution? Say, we've got solutions for government problems. And that's a different mindset.
Thank you. Can I just pick up on something that you said there at the end, that businesses can just get on with it? But can I ask kind of everybody in the panel, how do you encourage businesses who might not have the social consciousness of co-op? Like, how do you encourage businesses to kind of take up these opportunities, to enable other people to take up the opportunities so there is much greater social mobility?
I think there's something about, I've got quite a few CEOs, and CEOs like a moment in the sunshine, right? And if they do something good, they'll get a moment in the sunshine. I think government can help that. I think government can halo people, say, look at them, they're doing a great thing. There's that point. But the more important point, it comes back to what Alan said. Myself and my colleagues from the Co-op in the room are having conversations with our business. We're a retail and a life services business, but particularly in retail, you've got a high turnover of staff, right? Therefore, your demand on the labour market is huge. Mm-hmm. We are genuinely getting into conversations now about how we can enrich and make more stable our talent pipeline through things like, Emma mentioned slave survivors, but ex-offenders, people far from work, young kids. We run 37 academy schools across the country. The transition of young kids into work. There is, aside from the moral case and aside from the people who want the glory, there's just a really simple business case here. Yeah. That if you don't do this kind of stuff, you're going to get left behind. And I think that's probably what we need to have a conversation. My CEO, Shireen Curry-Hack, often says, and it was Alan's point, valuing diversity isn't some kind of woke stuff. It's just really hard-headed business because you get better people and you get a richer talent pool. So I think you've got to make the business case for it. This is why it's important, because you'll be more successful.
Can I ask any other members of the panel have kind of views on that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think it's about making the case. Well, government will, trim off the excesses within this. I think that there's a case, but I think with the direction of the government and sort of with that growth and opportunity mission, actually, Paul is right. If businesses don't change, don't embrace this, they will get left behind. And in particular, with the job market as it is, they are in a very competitive field. So I think it's no surprise where cooperatives are doing this. Young consumers are more attracted to those companies. They want to work for those companies, and actually, it just makes sense for them to do that.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, obviously there's lots of data out there now. Like Harvard study showed 79 large companies, for every 0.1 increase in their DEI, that improved profits, that improved performance. So I think sharing data, I think you've got to show case studies as well. So, if a business works in a certain category, whether it's travel or fashion, you've got to be able to show examples of businesses that have, pursued diversity, pursued social mobility, and clearly it's made a difference. I do think government, people like yourselves, whoever, need to also just tap into what I've just written down here as kind of zeitgeist riding. And what I mean by that is that most businesses are trying to grow somewhere. They're trying to get somewhere. They're trying to kind of ride a wave. And I think, again, being able to connect the benefit of a more diverse or a more socially mobile workforce to helping them achieve those goals is really important. And then the final thing I would say is that there is something about fighting off some fallacies, right? So I was at a dinner last night sitting next to Tony Travers, kind of historian. We were talking about London, we were talking about migration. And he said, actually, all the research, all the data shows that for every migrant that comes to this country, they don't take a job, they create another job. And so I just think for a lot of businesses, they also live in an equivalent fallacy, which is that, if you take on more diverse or non-traditional talent, it's going to be hard to integrate. They're not going to deliver. They're not going to do a good job. And so we need to take that head on and address it and provide data to say, no, look, this is fallacies, and you know, this talent is great, and there's ways to integrate people.
So I think there's, I think all of that is correct. I think there's, you need a push and a pull, you know, with all of these things. And this is where government is important, I think. You know, so it's interesting if you look at other areas of diversity and inclusion, you know, a long way to go on gender and on race. But the truth is, you know, we are making progress over time, not where you want it to be, but it's moving forward. And in part, that has been, the impetus for that has been, frankly, legislation and regulation. Yeah? So we collect data, for example, you know, in a way that we don't collect data on social economic background. That's going to be an important thing. That is coming, by the way. You know, that is, I don't know when it's going to happen, but I think, you know, it's likely, I think, or possible, a Labour government will enact that, and, you know, we will have more data around, and data always shines a spotlight, as it did when it was first published around the gender pay gap, for example. Still too wide, but narrowing for a reason, because you can see it, it's visible, and people feel, that doesn't look too smart, better do something about it. So you've got that. I think, look, you know, it's really interesting with business. I don't know if anybody reads the Edelman Trust Barometer that's published annually. And it's a really very compelling global study of public attitudes to trust. And I mean, I suppose it's obvious in a sense, the organizations that are most trusted in the world today are definitely not governments, definitely not media organizations, sadly not charities, businesses. Business is trusted, but it's conditional trust. It's based upon whether businesses are good social actors as well as good economic ones. So the terms of trade are changing about what a good employer looks like. Yeah, it isn't about hero CEOs and the bottom line and what you drive. Of course, that remains instrumental to what a business is. That's what I do in my life nowadays. You know, it's been in business for sort of 15 years after politics. But there's also another driving purpose, and it is this lines between sort of profit and purpose, which is, you know, what the phrase that Stephen was using earlier. So there's something about creating a movement around this. You know, I really believe this is a really important thing. You know, look at what's happened in society. So many of the changes that have happened of late over these last few years have not come from above, they've come from below. So think of the Green movement. I don't mean the Green Party, but I think about, you know, where that change has come from. You know, David Attenborough's probably had more impact than any legislation any government has passed. It just has. Think about Black Lives Matter. Yeah. Think about the environmental movement. These are things that are coming from below, not above, and these are good things in my view. They heighten what a democracy is. They don't undermine it. So we've got to create a social movement for change. So one of the small things that we do is the Social Mobility Foundation. We publish every year a Social Mobility Employers Index, which ranks. It's a data-driven exercise. It's really quite tough in terms of the data that we ask for. It's not easy, right? And we rank employers according to how good they are as social mobility employers across a whole series of KPIs. And what it's doing is it's sort of creating a movement. You know, I don't know how many entered the last one, Sarah, can you remember? 140, you know, but big, you know, employing collectively over 1 million people, in the country. And sort of it's growing across sectors and so on. So, you know, tech is now in, Amazon have come in, I think, you know, and so on and so forth. So this is all fantastic. We've got to create that. And I think there's two questions that I find that employers are asking now when I'm in conversations with them. You know, 10 years ago, the only question they ever asked me was why? Why should I really bother about this? Because I'm doing the gender stuff, I'm doing the race stuff, really. That's my D&I. Okay, oh, what's all this class stuff? Blah, blah, blah. And you still get all of that, and there's still, but largely what they're now asking is much more a how question. So how do we actually do it? Because it isn't easy. Yeah. Not least because class isn't as visible, to be honest. And so we've got to be able, for people who care about this, you've got to be able to disaggregate the how. and make it as easy as it can be. And look, there are we publish a lot of stuff on this and work with employers, and there's a lot of stuff about how you do your recruitment practice, how you do your retention practice, how you do your progression practice. We're accumulating more of an evidence base about the things that work and make it as easy as it can be. I mean, the only slight point of difference I have with what Stephen says is that, think about this economic inactivity problem. And you referenced the work that I did in Barnsley with the Pathways to Work Commission. You've got a huge problem now in society with, frankly, it's a health problem rather than a benefits problem, principally. And you've got these people who've been out of work sometimes for quite a long time. They're very anxious about stepping back into the workforce. Probably you've got, some mental health issues, depression, anxiety, maybe alongside a physical condition, MSK, back pain, or high blood pressure, or whatever it is. And to get them back into the labour market, sure, there's lots of things that you need to do, align health and employment support better and devolve employment support to mayors and all the stuff that the government will do. But it does mean that employers have got to put in a bit of extra effort, and we shouldn't be naive about that. It's not straightforward. It just isn't. And I think we just got to get that messaging right and help employers to do what they want to do and make it as easy as possible for them to do it. So we have a responsibility as well, because otherwise, if people look at it and think, maybe I'll just continue as I am. The default setting usually as human beings is we generally do what we've always done, because that's the comfort zone that we all get ourselves into. Change is not easy, never, because it's about behaviours and so on and so forth. So I think there's some stuff about how collectively we take the learnings, government facilitates, enables, etc., and we help. It's easy if you're big. If you're a big organisation, if you're PwC or one of these organisations, it's relatively easy. It's not a coincidence that it's often these sort of big organisations that sit at the top of the Social Mobility Employers Index because they've got scale and they've got capacity and capability. If you're a medium-sized organisation or you're an SME, it's just much harder. And we've got to think about that in terms of what they need to enable them to do, frankly, some of the things that they'd probably like to be able to.
Thank you. I've got so many more questions, but I'm going to open it up to the floor. Fabulous. I'll take 3 questions at a time. Lady here.
Thank you. I just wanted. Do I need this?
No.
Sorry. I wanted to pick up Emma and Alan's points about labour shortages. It seems to me you made some fantastic points, but the one thing you haven't mentioned is those people who are in work, but in very bad work. And over the years, over the decades actually, we've seen this rush to the bottom in terms of cutting the cost of the people employed. So I'm thinking about the rise of the gig economy and zero-hours contracts. And we're not going to grow unless we have enough people. But we've got a ton of people trapped in, I can't remember if you said, but crap jobs. And we need ways to entice those people out of those jobs and offer them something better. So I'm thinking of government training and perhaps more regulation around those awful jobs, because people work for hours and they can't actually afford to live. And we've all heard the stories, I'm sure. So I was interested in your thoughts on that.
Thanks.
Gentleman at the back.
James from Cooperatives UK. Is there a greater role for cooperation between businesses to enable more of them to emulate the great things that the Co-op does, particularly perhaps to enable more SMEs to emulate those things?
Lovely. And there's another question at the back.
It's a point, but I'll try and turn it into a question, which is absolutely the point about moving from the why to the how, and the getting businesses to collaborate. So the point about businesses needing to step forward, all these small businesses, it's really difficult to aggregate their will, and I've seen a lot of, down from the Bristol Bath area, worked in tech, a lot of companies really want to do better for both the social impact and also their own. So they understand that alignment. But what we found is it doesn't take long to inspire young people, primary and secondary school kids, that there are opportunities for them, even though they come from, in fact, because they come from different backgrounds. But when we talk to these young people, the teachers would look, oh, I didn't know those opportunities exist. So how do we help inspire the inspirers in primary and secondary schools, which I've seen as one of the barriers? And it's not their fault. We're not giving the training to teachers to say what actually the modern workplace looks like.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got 3 questions there. How do we help people out of the really crap jobs that they're in and into better employment that's going to add greater value to their lives? How do we enable businesses to cooperate between them to make moves in this direction? And how do we inspire teachers who are inspiring our young people of like next generation? How do they know that the opportunities are out there? So it's not just I presume, traditional pathway, like you leave school, you go to university.
Absolutely.
How do we open this up
That's
to
still
other?
what they're told.
Let me take the middle one on how do you, James asked about how do you support businesses to cooperate. Sort of comes to the point I think you made as well, which every business will have a supply chain, right? We have 6,000 businesses that help put the food in the shops that we sell, etc. You have a relationship with that supply chain, and that's a very powerful relationship. So we've seen in a number of things we've done. In fact, today in our headquarters in Angel Square, we're running what we call an endless inclusion hub. So you've got lots of relatively small, medium enterprises who are our suppliers, and they really want to do the right things on a range of D&I issues, but they don't have the HR department to write the policy. They don't have the etc. You know, we just published a class pay gap report. I think we're the first retailer in the country to publish class pay gap report. They don't have the functions to do that. What we do is provide the how-to guides, because we've done it. It was our work. We learned. And we make them all available. We get them all together periodically, and we show it. So I come back to there is a role of businesses, especially big businesses, who have that influence that can support. And if they support, then actually everyone will be helped by that. Us as the top of that particular supply chain, will be helped. Got people who are in the same. And if I can give you another example, how it works. And I mentioned the Bright Future Cooperative, which is about slavery survivors. That was a project that Ali started 8 years ago. Most of the people who joined that, all the employees that joined the cooperative to offer opportunities to slavery survivors, were from our supply chain. Because we could speak to them and say, yeah, we like that, we're interested in that. And I think there's something there about that supply chain network that can really drive best practice and support those who don't have the big HR functions, for example, or whatever it may be.
Steve, can I come to you? Which is one of the questions, or more than one that you'd like to?
Yeah, I think on the low quality work, very quickly, I think we're at the end of that. Personally, I think we need to regulate and just intervene. You know, I live in New York, and you know, a couple weeks back, there was a lady delivering packages from Amazon for my neighbor. She was 7 months pregnant, trying to get into the building, and I was like, "What is going on?" You know, and she said, "I'm trying to deliver this." And I said, "No, you wait here. I'm going to go and call my neighbor, and he'll come. We'll help you take the shopping. We'll take the shopping up." And then I saw someone in her car, and I said, "Well, why isn't that person helping you?" She said, "That's my 9-year-old daughter that I'm driving around with." So I just think we're at the end with this kind of, you know, gig work, low quality work. You know, the government needs to intervene, and it will probably lead to businesses exiting. But then I think you might see more inclusive businesses come in and fill that gap with more quality jobs. So that's my take on low quality work. I think in terms of you know, how do you enable more cooperation between smaller businesses? I think we just need more hubs. You know, I've been a small business owner, and the reality is that when you're worrying about cash flow and paying salaries and whatnot, that just becomes the priority. So unless you're able to collaborate with other small businesses and have economies of scale, you have to focus on, you know, cash flow, people, customers, and whatnot. So where government can catalyze, enable hubs, enable cooperation, and support that, then small businesses can come together and really dig into this stuff. And then finally, just on how do we help inspire the inspirers? I mean, back in the day, I did a big program once in London called the London Schools Excellence Fund to try and, you know, build the education sector in London. And I just think there's this huge opportunity for schools and colleges to basically partner with businesses and entrepreneurs and bring people in, right, to kind of inspire young people and to show what the opportunities are. And I don't know, again, can government help to formalize or enable those relationships? Because what we can't do is ask teachers to kind of be teachers, carers, business inspirers, or whatever it might be. But we can ask teachers to act as facilitators and enablers, like a conductor, right? Bring in the different actors that might then help inspire our next generation. So yeah.
If I pick the first and the third, because I think there's a sort of a common theme there. I think around the type of work, we obviously have the New Deal for Workers, and given Angela's background in terms of that, I think she has a good understanding of what needs to change, and we will see that come forward. But I think we've talked quite a lot about employment and some of those bigger employers, but I think there's a whole area around startups and actually how to give agency to people with the ideas, give them the skills training and support to be their own employers and start up their own businesses. And we've produced a report about what needs to happen to help people to set up cooperatives and things like the gig economy. Like you said, if Uber was a co-op, but in housing, social care, there are lots of opportunities where actually this business model and having the right people in there could be some really good startup opportunities, and we need to look at how we encourage that, because startups are as much about that growth mission as in terms of the business as well. And I think that goes to the education point. I think there is the cooperative movement. Over our history, we've talked about the shop with the classroom above. It's absolutely integral to that in terms of education and skills. But we have a challenge as a movement that in this country, there's literally only a couple of business schools that provide a module on cooperative business. How can that be the case? Less so around social enterprise. We need to make sure if we're inspiring people that we're creating a new generation of business leaders. And I think you're right, they're the people that are going to in schools and inspire rather than the teachers. But how do we actually get people into that and being those cooperative business leaders? Because at the moment that education and that support just isn't there.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to build on that, maybe look, one of the things, very practical things, the particular for medium and larger businesses that they can do is they can do much more active partnering with schools. And this is not even necessarily about increasing their own recruitment pipeline, but it is about bringing awareness, possibility, potential to kids. And some do it. One of the reasons that you've had this absolute revolution in my lifetime in the performance of London state schools. 35 years ago, these were the basket cases, to be clear. They're the best performing schools in the country now. And in fact, for a kid on free school meals, the performance at 5 GCSE level is about 50% higher than schools in any other part of the country. It's a remarkable turnaround. And it's a consequence of lots of things. It's a consequence of demography. It's a consequence of young teachers, despite high living costs in London, wanting to be in the capital. They'd rather be in London than, Workington, for whatever reason. And so you've got a pool of talented teachers who've sort of gone there and are inspired and inspiring. But it's also because employers, look, if you go to Tower Hamlets, you can't move the bloody bankers. With all these bankers from city law firms are going out doing their social value, ESG stuff, visiting in my old constituency in Darlington, never saw a banker. I don't know whether that's a blessing or a curse, but it's just true. And so we've got to think about how is it that we sort of even that playing field a bit, and particularly get the businesses with large national footprints to think about where can they have most impact. Okay, so that's a very simple thing. I think there's a broader thing about schools, which is, look, the truth is we're teaching a 20th century analog curriculum. And if you talk to any employer, anywhere, what do they want? Of course, they want the basics, absolutely. Of course, it'd be really good if kids could write and sort of do all that sort of stuff, maybe do a bit of analysis. But employers increasingly, they're wanting kids that are creative, collaborative, communicative. Those are the skills that we need for the future. And that's not what the curriculum facilitates. So Bridget's doing this curriculum review, thank God, and not a day too soon, because it needs to be fundamentally changed, in my view, to provide an accent on future capabilities, not on the acquisition of past knowledge. That's what we do. Okay. So there's a bigger point which sort of surrounds the point that you're absolutely rightly met. On this good work thing, look, there's we've got to make work as good as it can be. But we also have to be sensible about this, that there are going to be some jobs that are not terribly attractive jobs. Yeah. Working in a care home is a difficult job. It just is. And we've got to make it as good as it can be. And that's partially about pay. The pay has consequences, not least when it's funded from the public purse, because of a lot of residential care costs are picked up in the end by the Exchequer. Which isn't to say that you shouldn't keep raising the living wage, and you've got to grow the delta between what people can get on benefit and what they can get in work if you want to incentivize people back into employment. It's all of that. We've just got to be careful we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because actually a lot of people want the flexibility that Britain's flexible labour market provides. It's a competitive advantage for us in a very competitive world. The issue is, how do we get the right balance between flexibility and security? So I don't agree with the current model where you get a lot of flexibility, but you get zero security. So if you're a delivery driver, okay, you can choose your hours and all that sort of stuff maybe, but if you get ill, there's no support for you. If you have an accident, there's no support for you. So we've got to get, and this is where the Angela's New Deal is such an important thing, to calibrate that. And I think there's a macro deal to be done around what the right balance is between flexibility and security, and I think that's out of whack at the moment. But we've got a formidable challenge here, because we sort of kidded ourselves as a nation, and public policy makers have kidded ourselves too, that if you get people onto the bottom end of the labour market rung of the ladder, that people automatically will then be able to rise up. I mean, the data tells a very different story. Only 1 in 6 people who were low paid in 2006 had escaped low pay by 2016. The overwhelming majority of them women. The overwhelming majority of them are stuck in certain sectors of the economy, hospitality and care being the sort of two main ones. They've got structural problems, in that profit margins are often very low. The care sector is very precarious, social care sector. I mean, we need to, in my view, there needs to be a revolution, massive change there. So you're dealing with some sort of quite tricky issues where there are tensions between sort of public policy objectives, and we've got to navigate our way through that very carefully, which isn't to say that you're not right. We've got to make good work possible. One of the very simple things that we recommended in this Barnsley report that Emma was alluding to earlier is we recommended that the government accredits, but employers agree what the nature of good employment looks like. So that we have a sort of good employers charter, which basically says, okay, if you provide flexibility, if you provide support, if you provide decent occupational health, if you provide opportunities for progression, not a million miles away for some of the data that we utilize in the Social Mobility Employers Index, and you make that a visible thing. So it's visible, and it's about, we've got to get this sort of, we've got to create, it's a social movement thing that we've got to create. Social movements change things. And your point about businesses can do things, but what governments can do is enable businesses to do things, create the conditions. And then what you find is that the people who are thinking about it, they sort of join in. There's a group of people who don't, and they're more recalcitrant and all that sort of stuff, and you've got to think about different approaches. But I'm very old-fashioned in believing that most people are good rather than bad. And so if you give people an opportunity to join something that's good, generally people do. So that's what we've got. So this stuff is all about that. It's not nudge theory. But it's a bit of that, I guess. It's about sort of creating this sort of sense of possibility, and we can all join in, which is what cooperation does.
So we've got a couple of minutes. I just want to finish by asking the panel a very, very quick question, and in 30 seconds. Obviously, we're sitting in the Labour Party conference. It's a political conference. If you had one message for government about something they could do to create those conditions, so you've all talked about kind of that we need to bring businesses and government and civil society and employers and employees together to kind of work together to tackle this issue. If you have one message for government about something that they could do to improve social mobility, can I ask you, what would it be? Stephen, can I start?
I'd say for the government to behave entrepreneurially, so catalyze, make deals, kind of use your power, your legitimacy, and the financial power you have to act entrepreneurial on behalf of citizens to make sure that we build a more inclusive economy.
Thank you. Emma.
So mine is you can't uncouple growth from the social mobility issues. So I think it needs to be integral to the growth mission and to removing their barriers and make it part of that. And that's what we believe with property as well. Obviously, recognition of that wider. But I do want to just say one thing in terms of we've talked a lot about barriers and the challenges, but I'm incredibly optimistic. We've talked about change. This is an opportunity, a huge opportunity for us around this issue, and that we should take a lot of what we discussed today and be hopeful and create that movement.
Which is a lovely note to not quite finish on, but nearly. Paul.
So I think governments fundamentally regulate or don't regulate, and choice either way. I'm going to pick up on what Alan said. I think the reason we've seen gender pay gaps narrowing is because it gets really embarrassing, it gets really clear. Actually, good businesses find things they didn't know. Oh God, that happens. I think the sooner they regulate before class pay gap reports it'll drive report. What it will drive is it will make businesses understand who is getting in and who is getting on. And we've done that. We pushed our class pay gap report this year, and it told us things we didn't know. And it told us things we thought, that's not right. And then we're taking action. Now, some businesses might not choose to take action, but they'll have the data there. So I think if government's about regulation, indeed deregulating, I think that would make a significant long-term shift in how businesses view class.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I very much agree with that. I think that's absolutely. I mean, this class pay gap, for those people who don't know, it's basically looking at what pays people who come from very different backgrounds, essentially doing the same job. On average, it's about £7,000 per year, which is quite a lot of money, really. If you're sort of between £6,000 and £7,000, if you're sort of from a working class background, as distinct from a sort of better off background for doing the same thing. So that's quite a reveal. So I think this question about this is where governments can have, this is what governments do. They do legislation, regulation, taxation, so on and so forth. So they've got hard power, so to speak. And I think the hard power is really about, I've always been motivated by what data tells me. And so getting data out there, I think would be good. Collecting this sort of data and making that something that is expected rather than just something that happens amongst better employers would be a really good thing. I think there's a broader point, however. The other role that governments have, this sort of leadership role, is they've got to create narratives. That's what you do. You create a narrative. Mrs. Thatcher created a narrative about the country. I might like it, disagree with it. There's a narrative about the country, and people joined it in huge numbers. Tony created a narrative about the country, and we've got to do the same. The government's got to do the same. And the narrative has to be about reconciling things that people think are enemies, but which are actually friends. You can have an entrepreneurial economy and you can have a fairer economy. The two things actually go together. They mutually support each other. So my wish would be that when Rachel and Kia and everybody is talking about this sort of make that the end objective. Like, you don't have to sacrifice the one for the other. These two things are complementary, because if we don't get the best out of people, then we're not going to create the growth that we want to see. The best out of people is both a spatial question, geographically, all the devolution stuff, but it's also a social question. How do we ensure that people from very different backgrounds have their potential and talent unleashed and used, not just for their benefit, the benefit of their families and communities, but for the benefit of the nation?
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to draw the panel to a close. I just want to thank Stephen, Emma, Alan and Paul for joining us.